stop your whining. It wasn't going to last forever. The winning streak is over on Wall Street. It's Thursday, the 30th of August. Tonight, it's Washington versus Silicon Valley. Senators follow Donald Trump's lead by calling out Google. Argentina raises rates to 60%. Yeah, that number got your attention as it faces an IMF emergency. And Grindr is looking for a match. The gay dating app is going public. I'm Paula Newton, and this is Quest Means Business. Good evening. Donald Trump versus Google. The president is openly targeting one of the world's most powerful companies, repeatedly accusing Google of bias. Are these attacks signs of a storm brewing between Washington and Silicon Valley? We're probably about to find out. The powerful head of the Senate Finance Committee has sent a letter of concern to federal regulators, asking them to consider the competitive effects of Google's conduct. Now, two other senators are fuming at Google because it's declined to send its CEO or its COO to a major hearing. Now, Facebook's Sheryl Sandberg and Twitter's Jack Dorsey might end up sitting next to an empty chair, symbolic, with a Google nameplate. Now, a new McLaughlin and Associates poll shows 65% of conservatives believe social media censors political ideas like theirs. Now, a representative for some of the largest tech companies argues there's not only no bias in any of this, those people actually are provided an open platform for conservative voices other than on traditional media. Now, the Internet Association is a trade group that lobbies on behalf of major tech companies, including Facebook, Twitter, and Google. A short time ago, I spoke to its CEO, Michael Beckerman, and asked him why there is zero transparency about how these companies prioritize the content that you and I see.
I would say that on the internet, there's a lot more transparency on what you're seeing, why you're seeing it, than any other form of communication or media that's out there. There is no transparency as to how these companies conduct themselves, whether it's Twitter, Google. Google is a particular problem. We've asked them to come on this show. They refuse to come here and actually tell us how this is done or show us how it's done. It seems to be this big black box that no one can figure their way out of. I disagree with that. Look, everything from TV to your newspaper, any kind of media form, you're making decisions every day on what you're covering, how you're covering it, who's on. On the internet, literally anybody that wants to have their voice heard or anybody that wants to find any source of information that exists in the world can do that very easily.
But that's not the point, especially when most of us have limited, not just limited time, but a lot of people have limited bandwidth. They literally have limited speed. They are looking for the first and the easiest result on search.
And that's exactly why the internet is a great tool for so many people. And in the context of political speech, anybody who wants to have their voice heard can reach their audience directly. And particularly when you look at conservatives who for many years, and probably rightfully so, have complained about standard corporate media entities blocking their ability to speak, they can do that on social media, particularly Twitter and other services, where they can build audiences and have built audiences of millions and millions of people, and then they're able to be picked up on traditional media. And it's been a fantastic tool, an open tool, a transparent tool.
But Michael, I don't think anyone is disputing that, or perhaps maybe the president, who, like you said, has used the platform to win elections and then criticize the platform, point taken. But what people want to know is the information that they get. How is it served up to them and why? And they are suspicious of the bias. And now Senator Orrin Hatch, who is close, a Republican, he is close to the president, is asking the Federal Trade Commission to look into Google at least, and perhaps that will lead to other investigations. What do you think those investigations will find if the Federal Trade Commission decides to take it up?
I think in particular, you will find that there's no evidence of political or conservative bias, and that the platforms that exist on the internet are open and transparent for anybody to use on the right or the left. And that's why they flourish, and that's why so many millions of people around the country and around the world have used it. And you mentioned the president. He frankly has been one of the best users of social media to reach his audience, and he's been able to do it in an unfiltered way. And certainly he's had a lot of complaints with media coverage, and that's his right to do so. But on social media, he can reach anybody that is interested in his message in an exact, precise way, as he intends it, when he intends it, and without a filter. And that's a very important thing for speech and democracy around the world.
But in criticizing the tech executives, he's really hitting a nerve. Why do you think people in general are so suspicious of the tech companies that you represent?
Well, a couple things. I mean, one, it is not in the business interest of any of the companies to pick one side over the other. These platforms are for all Americans, all people around the world, and they make sure that the platforms are neutral in that way. Part of what we're seeing here is actually a little bit ironic or interesting that people are using the platforms to complain about the platforms. And so in the example of search, you can do a search of Trump news as he said, and sometimes Fox News is the first thing, but also right up there are the tweets complaining about the platforms. And that's something that you can do on social media, you can do on the internet, but really you can't do on other programs or other forms of media. And again, that's an important distinction.
Okay, understood. I still would like to know why you're here representing. We're glad to have you, that you came here to represent these companies. Why won't these companies come on programs like this more often, especially companies like Google? We did have Twitter on a couple of weeks ago. Jack Dorsey, in fact, said that his staff was mainly left-leaning, even though he disputes the fact that his organization is in any way, shape, or form leaning left or right. But why won't these companies come on to speak for themselves?
Look, the platforms themselves have no ideology, and at any company, there are people within the companies that have right or left leanings, and that has no impact whatsoever on those companies or organization. And you mentioned Twitter and Jack Dorsey. I mean, he's going to be up there on Capitol Hill next week testifying in front of the Energy and Commerce Committee about this very issue, and I think that's very important, and I applaud him for that, and I applaud the committee for having him, and that will shed some light on the practices of Twitter in particular and how social media works. And it's very important that we educate our policymakers and are more transparent and open about how the platforms work, and Jack Dorsey's doing that.
So you think it's a good thing, this kind of a hearing, and I add that you have years of experience on Capitol Hill, and you know what these hearings are all about.
Absolutely, and I think, when you look at some of the hearings they've had over the last few months in particular, it's clear that we as an industry do need to do a better job of educating policymakers. And on the policymaker standpoint, they have a lot to learn as well about the platforms. And so when Mark Zuckerberg testified, I view that as a very positive thing. Certainly it shed to light a lot of practices and actually a lot of positive things they know about.
I'm not sure it sheds a lot of light on anything, actually, which is why I would prefer that you would tell organizations like Google that you represent to just take requests from media and answer some very direct questions.
Well, I'm sure your bookers do a fine job of getting people on the programs.
And still we get no, year after year, month after month. It's as if they're running some kind of secret society. I would say to you that the viewers want to hear from Google. They want to hear from Twitter. They want to hear from Facebook more often and with more substantive answers as to how they're doing what they're doing.
Companies have made statements on this, and again, I think it is a very big stage, in particular, going up to Capitol Hill and the Energy and Commerce Committee to talk about this issue, and I'm sure your network and many others will cover it, and that's very open, and people can read about it and learn more.
And we will be watching here on CNN. So what is President Trump thinking in all of this? For some insight, Oliver Darcy has spoken to, in fact, Steve Bannon, who is the former White House chief strategist. He advocated, in fact, Oliver, that, we should be breaking up these tech companies. Yeah. I was fascinated by your conversation with him. And I guess the answer is this where Donald Trump is getting some of these ideas and has been listening to Steve Bannon for months, really?
It's unclear whether he's been listening to Steve Bannon recently, but we know that when Bannon was in the White House, he was pushing these very similar policies. And Bannon thinks that these companies are too big, that they're unregulated, and he wants government now to come in, regulate them. He equated it to Teddy Roosevelt breaking up the trust. He says these companies are extremely powerful. Government should come in, break them up, regulate them. And then he also wants to seize the data from these private companies, put it into a public trust run by an independent board of directors, and then let people opt in and opt out of whether they share their data with this big public trust.
In terms of where this will lead us, I mean, I was just saying to Michael there from the Internet Association that Orrin Hatch has now written a letter. Now, he's written many letters about Google and other search engines. They are very they do not trust the tech companies. We keep saying no, regulation is unlikely. It's impossible. And yet, is it not a question mark for these companies right now as they appear before Congress?
I think it's certainly a question mark. And I think people, the investors of these companies, are wondering what's going to happen in Congress. The companies for themselves, they've been really reaching out to Republican officials ever since the new administration came into Washington. There was a New York Times article, for instance, about Google's outreach to the administration, to Republicans in Washington, because I think they do realize that it is possible that there could be regulation implemented on their businesses. Whether that happens, it's unclear. Right now, I think it's still more of a campaign issue for these guys. They know that this excites their base. It gets them into a frenzy. It brings them out to vote. But that could very well lead to regulation on these businesses, and that's something that the companies are probably very worried about.
Yeah, and they should be worried about it in the sense that investors are watching carefully. I mean, to give Facebook some credit, the investors actually blame them, saying Facebook has actually cut into their profits by trying to deal with this issue. Right. Do you think, though, that all along this is just kind of an evolutionary thing? I mean, Steve Bannon was going on about putting him into a trust. As I said, he's from Goldman Sachs. He was acting like he was the head of some socialist party, talking about, well, no, we need control of the data. That's what he was saying.
When I talked to him, he said that this is an issue that the left and right can agree on. He thinks that this is an issue that can pull Bernie voters into the Republican Party, or at least into behind the Trump agenda. And I think that's something that's key. He knows this is a campaign issue. He says that it's not probably going to be the hot button issue during the 2018 election, but come 2020, he thinks this is going to be a key domestic issue, and he wants to position the Republican Party and the Trump administration behind being skeptical and being against, effectively, these tech companies, saying they're too powerful, they need to be reined in. He called the executives, he specifically called the executives, he said they're evil, and there's no doubt about it. He called them liars, and really harsh rhetoric from someone who was the chief advisor to a Republican president. It's really actually stunning to see them move against private businesses in this way.
Yeah, he called them sociopaths. I mean, it's stunning stuff. One thing you're absolutely right about, and he is left and right? They're both going to be interested in these hearings. It doesn't matter what the political spectrum, the full spectrum will be listening in to see what's happening.
And I think there are real concerns, too. People do have real concerns about these tech companies and how much power they have, what they do with their data. I do think, though, that Bannon's rhetoric and the president's rhetoric often not grounded in reality. And so there's a conversation to be had. I'm not sure this is really the one we want to have, but...
Well, it'll be very good viewing. I've already got the popcorn ready next week for these hearings. Appreciate it, Oliver. Now, desperate times call for desperate measures. The world's highest interest rates just got even higher by a lot. We'll discuss Argentina's growing economic crisis, and the clock is ticking in Washington for Canadian officials to reach a trade agreement. We'll hear from the country's former Deputy Prime Minister, John Manley.